Hello and welcome to the Management with Impact podcast from the Department of Management at the London School of Economics and Political Science with me, Danny Marenghi. Today I am joined by Dr. Pavel Kireyev. Pavel is an assistant professor in the Marketing Faculty Research Group. In this episode, we discuss his recent research, looking at preferences for large language model refusals, implications for moderation and market structure. Pavel, thank you for joining me today. Before we get started diving into your research, could you please tell us a bit about yourself, your position here at LSE, and your primary research focuses?
Yes, well, thank you very much, Danny. So I focus on digital platforms, quantitative marketing, analytics at the London School of Economics as a faculty member. Specifically, I'm researching how people use digital platforms, how we can use data from these platforms to improve their design, to improve operations. And prior to LSE, I was at INSEAD, where I taught artificial intelligence strategy in the MBA program for several years. And before that, I worked at a machine learning startup, which was started by my classmates at Harvard. And we were working on integrating data science into digital platforms. It was one of the first companies that was focusing on this almost 10 years ago.
And you've just released a new paper on looking at large language model refusals. Could you give us a kind of 30-second top-level overview of what you're looking at in this paper?
Yeah, this research paper is studying how artificial intelligence safety policy affects competition in the market for AI systems. So specifically, we're interested in how people use large language models like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, specifically consumer usage, and how people may be using these models in ways that are risky or potentially unsafe. It turns out that a small fraction of the requests that people send to these models are tagged as being risky or sensitive. Now, at the same time, there's regulation on the horizon. Policymakers in the EU, in the US, and other major markets are thinking about how to best regulate artificial intelligence safety. And in this paper, we're really interested in finding out how will different policies affect competition. So is it possible that AI safety regulation, while it has the best intentions, can have unexpected consequences and affect competitiveness in the market, potentially by encouraging larger players to capture more market share and being a weakness for the smaller players in the market? That's what we're interested in studying in this paper.
Amazing. Oh, you've gone over so many things I want to ask you questions about in there. But I mean, starting from the top, for anyone who's listening who might not know, and you've mentioned large language models like Claude or ChatGPT, but what exactly do we mean when we're talking about a large language model? Is it just an AI chatbot?
So in the context of the research that we're talking about today, large language models are systems that consumers, that users interact with. They're able to ask questions, they're able to receive responses in natural language and text. And these include AI chatbot systems like ChatGPT, like Anthropic's Claude system, like Gemini, like Grok by xAI. Overall, these systems are based on a very powerful form of machine learning that has ingested a massive amount of data from all over the internet, also from additional sources. Nowadays, companies are hiring workers to train AI because AI is getting so advanced that we need very specialized knowledge to make these systems more powerful. So overall, these systems are able to interact with users, they're able to answer their questions, they're able to generate content beyond text, including video, images, and so on. And in the context of this research, we focus specifically on the consumer versions of these systems. The alternative is enterprise versions of these systems. So currently, large companies are integrating, typically through application programming interfaces, with AI systems as well. And they're intending to use these systems to improve the productivity of their workers, to assist them in their everyday tasks. However, in this research, we're focused mostly on user interaction with the consumer versions of these systems. So you can think of these as chatting applications online where a user might open a website, like ChatGPT, ask a question, receive a response, and then continue based on that.
So what does the current landscape for AI regulation in large markets like the US and EU that you mentioned previously, what does that look like currently at the moment?
AI regulation is very volatile right now. and it differs across markets. In the European Union, there's a more comprehensive framework. There's the EU AI Act that was put into effect recently, and over the next 2 years or so, will propagate across the market. In the EU, there's also the Digital Services Act, which is related, but more so targets online platforms, social media applications, and encompasses AI content to some extent. However, the EU AI Act is also quite general. So in terms of AI, it also encompasses more traditional forms of machine learning algorithms, like recommendation systems, for example, or ad targeting systems. And part of it is related specifically to generative AI, which includes large language models and the types of technologies that we're studying in our research. At the same time, the EU Act isn't incredibly specific. It provides some general guidelines about different categories of AI risks, how companies should try to address those risks. But implementation, we still have to see how it's going to be implemented in reality. In the US, there isn't a comprehensive AI regulation framework. There was an executive order issued by the Biden administration in 2023, which mimicked in many ways the EU AI Act and suggested different frameworks for thinking about AI safety. But this order was actually revoked recently. And in the US, there's a lot of debate around whether some of the Digital Services Act or AI Act restrictions imposed by the EU can actually go against free speech in the US. As a result, there isn't a comprehensive regulation in the United States at the moment. Different states are taking things into their own hands and adapting policies that they see fit. The federal government is attempting to coordinate everyone. But overall, it's in flux. The US is really trying to balance innovation with safety. The EU is trying to do the same, but with a more comprehensive form of regulation issued up front. But overall, it's not clear what the regulation should be in its final form. And specifically, there is the intention, however, to target how people are using AI and whether it's necessary to restrict the ways in which people can interact with AI. That's what we're interested in looking at in our research, is how regulations as they form might have downstream effects and affect people's choices of which AI they use and the overall structure of the AI market.
It's really interesting what you said, that the current administration recently revoked that executive order from the Biden administration. Would you think that's kind of leading to a wild west of AI regulation in the US at the moment? There was that story recently from X, with the Grok AI producing images of people without their permission, using kind of the deepfake technology. And there was a huge backlash against that in the EU and the UK with the threats to ban Grok or restrict X in some way. Is that what the US regulation is trying to look at or allowing to happen with its kind of lax rules?
In the US at the moment, there's a very big push towards innovation. There's also a lot of lobbying from the AI firms to prevent regulations that might be too strict, that might prevent the US from being competitive in a global market. And as a result, there's a tension between ensuring that AI is used in a safe way, while at the same time ensuring that the US market remains competitive internationally. And this causes the regulation to be in flux. Regulation can help markets evolve efficiently, but if implemented in a way that isn't well thought out, it can also hinder innovation and hinder competition. And that's something that we actually identify in our work. We discover scenarios where AI safety regulation can create monopolistic outcomes or can make it more likely that monopolies emerge. So in particular, we want to contribute to this discussion. We recognize that AI regulation in the States, in the EU, is still taking shape, and we want to provide an evidence-based, data-driven perspective on what kinds of AI safety regulations are intelligent and can contribute to both enhancing competition in the AI market, which can contribute to innovation, which can contribute to global competitiveness, while at the same time ensuring that AI is not used in ways that are extremely unsafe and that can lead to harm to society.
So there's 2 points there that I'd really love to expand upon a bit more with you. The one is on how does the regulation lead to monopolization, as you say, and the other is on the kind of allowing risky prompts and what those sort of look like. Could you first explain a bit more about how the regulation might lead to monopolization?
So regulation can create scenarios where the largest firms in the market, are at an advantage compared to smaller firms in the market. One obvious way in which this can happen is that regulatory compliance becomes so difficult to ensure that smaller firms just can't afford to comply, and as a result they exit the market or they don't enter to compete in the first place, whereas larger firms have the resources to hire lawyers, to hire compliance officers, to partner with firms that make it easier to comply, and as a result they're able to survive and sustain themselves. Now, the aspect that we investigate in the context of AI safety in particular is how safety regulations might impose restrictions on companies that are more difficult for smaller companies to uphold compared to larger companies. So in particular, we're interested in regulations that require firms to make sure their AI systems do not respond to certain types of prompts. Like, for example, you could envision that there's a universal moderation algorithm, which is an algorithm that scans all of the prompts that people are sending to AI systems, and it decides if this prompt is deemed to be sensitive or risky or that can potentially lead to harm in the future. Firms can, or regulators can require firms to adhere to this type of a moderation system. And as a result, this might lead to scenarios where smaller firms are no longer able to attract certain types of customers and certain types of users that maybe would make such requests, but which don't have which would not potentially suffer if they do make such requests, because the implications would not be so significant for these types of users. So that can lead to scenarios where the larger firms are able to benefit, whereas the smaller firms are not able to.
So what does a risky prompt look like then? Because you've said they would regulate to stop these risky prompts to reduce harm, and surely anyone would be in favor of reducing harm. So what would be the benefit of allowing a smaller firm to let someone ask and respond to a risky prompt?
Yeah, so first of all, it's important to define what exactly is a risky prompt and what falls into the scope of risky prompts. So from the perspective of content moderation, on digital platforms, it's estimated that about 3 to 10% of the content that's submitted to these platforms is risky or sensitive to some extent. For example, on Reddit, this number is between 4 to 6%. On social media platforms like Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, it's estimated to be about the same. In large language models, we estimate that this number is on the order of 4% based on the data that we have available. And this typically entails various risky requests like users attempting to ask for financial advice, which seems to be extreme or in some way not so well informed. It can involve requests about building weapons and doing other dangerous things. Ex ante, it's unclear what the intention is behind these requests, but they all get classified as risky and sensitive requests. Another growing category is people interacting with AI in various parasocial ways, trying to build a relationship with the AI system, asking the AI for advice, developing deeper connection with the AI systems. All of these requests, which constitute about 3 to 10% of people's interaction with platforms, would be classified as being risky or sensitive by some of these moderation systems. And the interesting thing is that of these requests, only a very tiny fraction would actually lead to negative impact in real life. However, their negative impact can be very significant. That's why this is an interesting domain for policymakers to investigate. But it's also very difficult to understand what are really the best policies, because the prevalence of these requests is not so common, and the chances that they lead to a behavior which is very negative are very low. But if they do lead to such a behavior, the impact can be very large. So it can be quite difficult to understand what are really the best policies. And what we argue in the paper is that Smaller companies tend to have models, AI models that don't perform quite as well as the large companies because the smaller firms don't have the same resources and aren't able to invest as much, at least initially. As a result, when users make requests that are deemed to be risky to these smaller providers, the chances that this will lead to extreme harm are not as high. However, this gives these smaller firms a chance to compete in the market compared to the bigger companies, as bigger firms tend to be more cautious in terms of how they handle risky content, and the consequences of submitting risky prompts to these larger firms can also be more significant because the models are more powerful. So in that sense, we argue that policies that give some latitude to the smaller firms can actually be helpful for competition in the market. Whereas policies that are more broad and that affect all companies in the same way, when it comes to AI safety, can actually have very adverse consequences for competitiveness in the market because they might actually kill off some of the startups that are no longer able to attract enough customers to their business, even though these startups may be okay with tolerating some users who make these risky requests.
So it sounds like the largest AI firms are currently self-regulating, if you will, to protect their brand, their image from facilitating these risky prompts, but allowing the smaller startups to have the freedom to respond to them, gives them the room to innovate and potentially create new, more innovative AI systems?
Right. So some good news, what we found in our data is that currently the larger firms are already implementing policies that are more stringent in terms of responding to various risky requests. For example, we find that the refusal rates, this is the rate at which a large language model or an AI chatbot refuses to respond to your request. It literally says something like, "I'm sorry, but I can't respond to this request. It goes against my policy," and it refuses to answer your prompt. The rate at which this happens for the larger players in our data is on the order of 30%, whereas for the smaller players, it's around 15%. So whenever a user submits a risky prompt, a prompt that's tagged by a moderation system as being sensitive, OpenAI or Anthropic will tend to refuse such prompts 30% of the time, compared to smaller startup companies or open source initiatives by labs. Their models will refuse only 15% of the time. So this suggests that in the market, we already have a situation where the larger firms are being more cautious compared to the smaller firms. And another interesting thing that we find is that naturally people are averse to refusals. They don't like it when they submit a request and the AI refuses to answer their request, even if this request is risky. And actually, especially so if this request is risky. That's what we see in our data. Because of this, we find that consumers or users of these AI systems are more likely to gravitate towards open source models and smaller models by startups because they believe that these models are less likely to refuse their requests. So it creates a natural separation in the market, which increases competitiveness between smaller startups and the larger players as a result.
That's really interesting. And it's not an entirely Wild West scenario with the smaller startup firms. Anyway, they refuse 15% of the requests. So anything that's really risky or really out there, they're still refusing anyway.
Right. So companies need to make sure that they don't respond to requests that are outright illegal. And in many cases, firms will make sure that their models are cautious about these requests, or they'll implement specially designed moderation systems that layer on top of their models, meaning that whenever a customer submits a prompt, a moderation system first decides if it wants this prompt to go through at all. And if this prompt passes that first layer of moderation, then the large language model will proceed to answer the question. Typically, when it comes to the most extreme forms of requests that are outright illegal, pretty much all of the startups and large firms will attempt to have an extra layer of moderation to prevent these kinds of requests from going through. What we're interested in our research is this set of 3 to 10% of risky requests that are not outright illegal, but fall into somewhat of a gray zone, where it's not really clear that these requests will necessarily lead to downstream harm. And as a result, it's not clear if they need to be completely banned outright. So we argue that these types of requests in particular, they create a space for smaller companies to compete in.
And these requests that fall into a grey zone, I mean, you touched on refusals and how people react to the refusals of their prompts. So if I understand correctly, if a user is refused to prompt from one model, he will or they will go to the best alternative option?
Right. So this has been shown in survey data. Surveys show that people tend to gravitate towards ChatGPT as their first choice, mostly because of awareness and brand reputation. About 50% of Americans have interacted with an AI system, according to these surveys, and 40-something% have interacted with ChatGPT specifically. Now, on the order of 2 to 19% have interacted with other systems. And typically what happens is that the user will find that they're not satisfied with their interaction with their first choice system or the system they're most aware of, like ChatGPT, for example, and they start experimenting with other providers, like Google's Gemini, like Claude's Anthropic, for example, or even more niche players like xAI's Grok, or startup and academic initiatives, if the user really finds that they're not able to get what they want out of these major systems. So it's not that uncommon for people to use multiple systems and to switch away from their first choice provider if that provider is not able to answer their request. As a result, it contributes to our argument that for startups who want to compete in this market, they need to be able to address a part of the market that the large players are not able to cover. Now, risky and sensitive content that happens to be such a portion of the market that for reputational reasons or because of outright safety concerns, the largest players aren't able to handle. So that's what's interesting about our research, is there's clearly a tension between safety and competitiveness. And it's not necessarily a good idea to allow for a market in which all unsafe content is completely fine and all the large language models are able to address this type of content. However, markets in which the policies are applied differently depending on the size of the company can lead to a scenario in which the market remains competitive or becomes even more competitive than it is currently, while the overall levels of safety in the market don't become worse or maybe even improve compared to their current levels. So in all of the analysis we do, we benchmark against the current state of the market as we estimate it based on the data we have available. And we want to make sure that we design AI safety policies that don't increase the levels of unsafe AI content and also don't increase the levels of concentration in the market. Ideally, we want to improve both of these metrics. And we find policies that can actually guide us in this direction. And also policies like, for example, universal moderation. You might think that it's not a bad idea to enforce the same requirements on all companies, requiring that all companies refuse sensitive content. We show that while those kinds of policies increase safety, they actually lead to increased concentration in the market, driving more demand towards the bigger players in the market, which could hamper innovation and which could really hinder the evolution of technology in this space, and also reduce the options that customers have available. So we're really interested in highlighting these trade-offs in particular.
That's a really interesting message for policymakers at the end, essentially asking or encouraging them to apply divergent policies based on the size of the firm. Do you have any insight in how they might go about doing this, what your key messages for them would be?
That's right. So first of all, as I mentioned before, the good news is that companies are already implementing these policies themselves to some extent. We observed that the largest providers like Anthropic and OpenAI tend to have the highest refusal rates for risky content compared to smaller startup initiatives, which have lower refusal rates and tend to be more likely to accept this content, and that this leads to a scenario where the market is more competitive. So demand, customer usage is spread more evenly across these providers as a result. This might imply that regulation is not necessary, not incredibly necessary at this point. However, we do find that there exist policies that can make the market even more competitive without hurting AI safety metrics at the same time. And specifically, we refer to these as divergent policies. These are policies which require the largest players in the market to refuse any kinds of risky requests that go through their platforms, while allowing for the startup players, the smaller companies, the open source initiatives that might not be as well capitalized to address these requests as they see fit, potentially answering all of them or having refusal rates that are not incredibly high. Whatever these companies find is suitable for their business. As the companies grow and become larger and acquire more market share, then stricter regulations can kick in that require these companies to follow more stringent refusal policies for risky content. Now, we find that such policies that are divergent in the sense that they target larger firms in different ways compared to smaller firms can lead to improvements in AI safety. And the reason they improve AI safety is because the rate at which people will ask risky requests to larger providers like ChatGPT and Claude will go down because they know that they're going to be refused. At the same time, the rate at which people will ask risky prompts to the smaller providers will increase, but the extent to which risky requests go down to the larger providers will outweigh the increase of risky requests to the smaller providers. So overall, AI safety will actually improve. At the same time, market concentration will also improve because now the larger players are really restricted in terms of the types of requests they can answer, and this will drive demand away from them towards smaller startup players. And this creates a more balanced spread of market shares in the market. Hence, such policies can actually lead to improvements along both of these dimensions. And that's what we identify in our research. We provide some estimates of these effects, and we argue that if policymakers do consider implementing AI safety regulations, they consider policies that are much more lenient when it comes to smaller players.
And that's because the proportion of people making those risky prompts is so small that even if the amount of risky prompts goes up among the smaller firms, the overall safety will increase because the largest firms are regulated more strictly.
That's right. So the fraction of risky requests is relatively small. We find in our data that about 23% of our sample includes users who do make risky requests, and the remaining set of users do not make these requests at all. So most of our analysis and most of these policies will most likely target a restricted segment of the market. Now, this market that does make these types of requests, this 23% of users, they tend to make risky requests about 11% of the time. So that translates to this rate of about 4% risky requests overall in the market. It's 23% of the users who make risky requests 11% of the time that leads to this overall set of risky requests. So the policies that we're studying will really affect this segment. Now, interestingly, even though this segment is not the largest segment in the market, even though they don't make risky requests most of the time, policies can meaningfully affect their behavior and meaningfully affect how they choose which AI systems to use because they are so averse to refusals. That's another effect that we measure in our data. So whenever a person is refused by an AI system, they have a very high likelihood of switching away from that system or picking a different provider who doesn't refuse that same request. So even though the set of users is not so large, even though the percentage of risky requests is not so large either, AI policies that affect the segment can meaningfully affect market concentration. Now, in terms of safety, the reason that you mentioned is precisely the correct reason as to why increasing and allowing for startups to issue more responses to potentially risky requests will not necessarily lead to a worse overall safety in the market. Namely, it's really the large firms that are being restricted, and the extent to which risky requests are being sent to these large firms is being reduced. And that outweighs the effect of an increase in risky requests being sent to the smaller firms. So overall, on average, the market may become safer as a result of this kind of policy, even though more risky requests are being sent towards the smaller players. Now, it's also important to note that the smaller players, their models are not as powerful, so it's less likely that when they do respond to the risky requests, the consequences will be very harmful.
That makes a lot of sense in my mind as a layperson, thinking about how someone might approach a large language model or a chatbot to ask it a question. You have to be quite dedicated in wanting the response that if you ask a large firm's bot a risky request and it refuses, you have to be quite dedicated to then think, I'm going to go to a smaller firm to try and get that response that I didn't get. That's how I might think about it in my own mind. There's a couple of final questions I want to ask you, but I'm quite interested in how you gathered all the data about users and their preferences and how they react to when they get refused. So what was kind of your methodology for the paper?
Right. So the data here is very important because in practice, it's very difficult to obtain data on how people actually use AI systems in the privacy of their home across all of the different AIs they may interact with. And it's also very difficult to collect data on unsafe AI usage because many of these data sets will be censored or restricted in some way by whoever is collecting and providing the data. That makes it quite a challenge to study the type of question that we were looking at. We ended up obtaining our data set from a platform called Marina. And Marina is a startup in California, out of the University of California at Berkeley, that provides a platform online where users can submit prompts, view the responses of different AI models to the same prompt, and choose their preferred response. Usually these responses are served to them in pairs. After I submit a prompt, I get 2 responses presented to me at the same time. I don't know the identities of the models that these responses are coming from, but I'm asked by the platform to pick which response I prefer. This data set is a proxy for measuring how people trade off between different types of responses when they submit safe requests and when they submit risky requests. Marina released a data set on Hugging Face, which is a platform for various open source machine learning tools, data sets, models, platforms, and so on. And this data set included information on both safe requests, unsafe requests being submitted to these systems, and people's choices between the 2 responses that they received to these requests. Now, from this data, we think of this data set as a sort of blind test. Similar to how you would do a blind test with wine or with food, this is a blind test, but with AI systems. Which system do you prefer? Which response do you like more? Now, it's important to note some limitations. First of all, this data set is a sample that tends to be technology savvy folks. So maybe people in the Bay Area go to this platform, they test different types of prompts, they use it as a way to contribute data that can then be used to train the AI systems or to decide for themselves which AI systems they prefer to use. It's also important to note that people know their data will be used for research, and hence the rates at which we see people submitting risky requests might be smaller than what we would see in practice. In that particular data set, we have a 4% risky request rate. In practice, it might be higher. It might be on the order of 8%, 10%, which is what people find on social media platforms at the extreme.
Because if you know that your prompts are going to be used for research and you're an avid risky prompter, you're not going to go to that platform to necessarily input your prompts there.
That's right. Interestingly enough, we do find several very risky prompts that are being submitted to this platform, but we do think that this rate might be underestimated compared to people's actual usage of these systems. So while it's important to note these limitations, some of the advantages of this data set are that it includes people's interaction with 20 models, including 4 proprietary models by OpenAI and by Anthropic, and 16 long-tail open source academic initiatives, smaller models, that lets us compare how people would trade off and choose which model they use based on the extent to which these models tend to refuse their requests. And as I mentioned, the dataset also preserves risky prompts. If you try to ask a sensitive prompt on the Marina platform today, Marina will actually prevent you from doing so. So increasingly, companies are starting to implement stricter moderation systems up front, which makes it difficult to study these types of questions.
So that will be a restriction to any future researcher who might want to have used that platform as a data source. So you've got in quite a good time.
That's right. And I think it was just very important for us to be able to study this question and to understand how people are really using these systems, and especially how are they using these systems in ways that might be somewhat extreme or risky. That was very interesting to us. It was very important for us to understand, especially in light of all the policy discussions that are happening right now. And we were able to do so because in the early days of generative AI, platforms were not implementing these restrictions up front, thereby preventing users from submitting these requests in the first place. And as we see this happening, for example, Ella Marina is now starting to implement these constraints. There is a risk that the market evolves in a direction where all of the companies start restricting, either because of policy or because of some form of beliefs about self-regulation. And what we show in our research is that this type of a scenario where all of the companies restrict responses to risky prompts actually leads to the most concentrated market, because smaller firms are not able to compete on that dimension. All of the companies are now the same in terms of the types of requests they respond to. So now they compete only on quality. And when they compete only on quality, it's typically the companies that have the largest resources, the best teams that they're able to hire, and maybe who have some privileges because they've been around for longer and have reached a certain scale, that are the ones that consumers are going to use. So I'm not sure if the fact that Ella Marina has implemented this constraint is a sign that we're headed in that direction. But it's something we want to caution against in our paper, that divergent policies or a market equilibrium where smaller companies have a bit more latitude in terms of how they handle risky prompts actually is better overall for the market in terms of AI safety compared to the current status quo, and also in terms of the competitiveness of the market.
So with these restrictions coming in and the ever-changing, super-fast nature of AI development and policymakers trying to respond to them, do you have any plans for where this research might go, or do you have any kind of recommendations or insights as to what other researchers should be looking at?
Yes, I think that in this research we're looking at consumer uses of artificial intelligence, and it's very important to understand how people might build relationships with AI that can lead to mental health issues down the line. We've seen cases of people committing self-harm as a result of building strong relationships with AI, and that's something that's very important to study. So I think in future research, it's very important to be able to, first of all, obtain data on how people are actually interacting with AI systems without moderation, without restrictions, because this will help researchers understand what the real limitations are of these systems. Obtaining this kind of data is not straightforward, but I think it's important for research and for progress and for understanding of what kind of regulations actually make sense, especially when it comes to the most extreme uses of AI. In the research we discussed today, many of the risky applications are just a little bit risky. They may not be extremely harmful. They may not lead to consequences that are very severe. But as I mentioned before, it's not that easy to obtain data on real severe interactions with artificially intelligent systems. So finding a way to study this, whether it's in a controlled environment, whether it's using historical data where these types of interactions have already occurred, I think it'll be important to go deeper in that direction. I also think that AI systems are evolving very quickly, and they're starting to take on more complex tasks that involve multiple steps, and they're starting to engage in more advanced types of research. So in addition to the uses of artificial intelligence and the potential harms that it can lead to from a consumer perspective, it's also important to study more enterprise-related efforts where firms might engage with AI in various ways that are unsafe, or organizations might engage AI to do research that is very complex, that is extremely consequential, for example, in biology and chemistry, research and development of novel types of weapons, which can be very, very dangerous. So understanding these types of uses, and specifically how this relates to the way in which the AI market is taking shape, I think will be very important. One more thing I want to mention is that currently the artificial intelligence market is relatively competitive. There are many different large players in the market as well as small startup initiatives. But revenues in artificial intelligence at the moment for many of these firms might not justify their business because many of these companies are supported by venture capitalists and by investments, sometimes national investments. They're part of a national AI strategy. So over time, we might see that the market starts to consolidate and become more concentrated. And I think one direction to take this research is to study how the market might evolve over time. As venture dollars start to evaporate, as investors start demanding higher revenues and more reasonable sort of business numbers, it will be interesting to see how will the market evolve. As companies start to exit, will there be consolidation? Will companies start acquiring and merging each other with each other? And in particular, how does the regulation in terms of safety affect this trajectory in which the market will evolve?
That's a really interesting place to take the conversation, because I know lots is happening around what is the value proposition from AI now, with how much it costs to build data centers, to run them, the energy it costs to keep them running. So I think that would be a really good topic maybe for a conversation in the future.
Absolutely.
Amazing. Pavel, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you very much. Very nice to connect and to talk about our research.